Nammo Phat. Good morning. Thank you for joining me for our daily practice check-in. Listen, listen, listen. This beautiful sound calls us back to our true home. The third mindfulness training. Aware of the suffering caused by sexual misconduct, I vow to cultivate responsibility and learn ways to protect the safety and integrity of individuals, couples, families, and society. I am determined not to engage in sexual relations without love and a long-term commitment. To preserve the happiness of myself and others, I am determined to respect my commitments and the commitments of others. I will do everything in my power to protect children from sexual abuse and to prevent couples and families from being broken by sexual misconduct. We're continuing to read Ajahn Thanissaro's essay, The Weight of Mountains, from his book, The Karma of Questions. So we start the path to the end of suffering, not by trying to drop our clingings immediately, but by learning to cling more strategically. In terms of the feeding analogy, we don't try to starve the mind. We simply change its diet, weaning it away from junk food in favor of health food, developing inner qualities that will make it so strong that it won't need to feed ever again. The canon lists these qualities as 5: conviction in the principle of karma, that our happiness depends on our own actions; persistence in abandoning unskillful qualities and developing skillful ones in their stead; mindfulness; concentration; and discernment. Of these, concentration at the level of jhana, or intense absorption, is the strength that the Buddhist tradition most often compares to good, healthy food. A discourse in the Anguttara Nikaya, 763, compares the 4 levels of jhana to the provisions used to stock a frontier fortress. Ajahn Lee, one of the Thai forest masters, compares them to the provisions needed on a journey through a lonely, desolate forest. Or as Dhammapada 200 says about the rapture of jhana, how very happily we live, we who have nothing. We will feed on rapture, like the radiant gods. As for discernment, when the mind is strengthened with the food of good concentration, it can begin contemplating the drawbacks of having to feed. This is the part of the Buddhist teaching that, for many of us, goes most directly against the grain. Because feeding, in every sense of the word, is our primary way of relating to and enjoying the world around us. Our most cherished sense of interconnectedness with the world, what some people call our interbeing, is at its most basic level inter-eating. We feed on others, and they feed on us. Sometimes our relationships are mutually nourishing, sometimes not, but either way, it's hard to imagine any lasting relationship where some kind of physical or mental nourishment wasn't being consumed. At the same time, feeding is the activity in which we experience the most intimate sense of ourselves. We define ourselves through the pleasures, people, ideas, and activities we keep returning to for nourishment. So it's hard for us to imagine a world, any possibility of enjoyment, even our very self, where we wouldn't inter-eat. Our common resistance to the idea of no longer feeding, one of the Buddha's most radically uncommon teachings, comes largely from a failure of the imagination. We can hardly conceive of what he's trying to tell us, so he has to prescribe some strong medicine to jog our minds into new perspectives. This is where his teaching on dukkha, or stress, comes into play. When the mind is strong and well fed, it can begin to look objectively at the stress involved in having to feed. The teachings on dukkha as a common characteristic focus on the drawbacks of what the mind takes for food. Sometimes it latches onto out-and-out suffering. It clings to the body even when racked with pain. It clings to its preferences and relationships even when these bring anguish, grief, and despair. Sometimes the mind latches onto pleasures and joys, but pleasures and joys turn stressful when they deteriorate and change. In any event, everything the mind latches onto is by its very nature compounded, and there's always at least a subtle level of stress inherent in keeping the compound going. This applies not only to gross external conditions, but even to the most subtle levels of concentration in the mind. May all beings be well. May all beings be happy. May all beings be peaceful. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you for joining me this morning.